What is Dungeons & Dragons without dungeons? The answer is dragons. Hilarity aside, how do you actually design these dungeons for your game regardless of your game system? We all know that it's about drawing rooms and connecting them with corridors, filling them with traps and monsters and puzzles and such. But where do you begin? And how do you ensure that the dungeon that you'd end up with actually fulfills the idea that you had to begin with? In this video, I'll show you how you can approach all of this in a systematic way that should hopefully make the process more manageable. I'll show the actual design process later in the video, but first we need the basics: theme, purpose, and just a general idea of the dungeon. So let us start with the theme. The theme of the dungeon can be divided into two equally important parts: the aesthetic theme, which deals with the visuals and the tactile parts of the dungeon design, and the philosophical theme, which is about the kinds of concepts that you play with in the dungeon, like life and death, descending out of darkness, healing old wounds, and so on. Theme is what makes the dungeon unique, and while visuals is probably the first thing that players remember about a dungeon, the philosophical theme will probably leave a deeper and more subtle impression. Maybe your players will talk about that dungeon that felt like they were clawing their way back to the surface and back to life, or the one that felt like a journey through some kind of moral dilemma. Maybe they won't remember as much that one that was just full of water. Or maybe they will. Thinking of a philosophical theme is a lot harder than the aesthetic one, so don't feel pressured to include one in every dungeon that you make. Just know that if you are able to find one, it'll elevate your whole dungeon significantly. I'm going to make a sample dungeon alongside this video to show the things that I talk about in action. So for this sample dungeon, let us go with these two themes. For the aesthetic one, I want to go to a place I haven't really visited since my early days of DMing, which was my homebrew campaign set in the middle of a desert. So the aesthetic theme will be desert and sand. For the philosophical one, I'll go with something perhaps a little bit depressing: the loneliness of isolation. Ideally, I want the players to feel increasingly alone and isolated as they go through the dungeon. Not an easy task, but it is a direction that I can try to follow. Even if I don't get there entirely, it'll probably leave some kind of impression on the whole dungeon anyway. Picking the theme is the first step in making our design of the dungeon more conscious and less arbitrary. And with this in the bag, let us move on to the purpose of the dungeon. Like the theme, the purpose can be split into two. The actual purpose of the dungeon, like why was it built, who built it, when, how. This is important to think about because it informs what kinds of rooms there will be in the dungeon, the amount of traps, the use of puzzles, and so on. The other purpose is the game purpose. Why is a dungeon in your game? Is it to provide some kind of constrained content to an otherwise very open game? Is it to give the players a tough challenge to try out their new abilities and items? Is it a way to present a lot of lore and exposition in an engaging way? Whatever the purpose, it's good to think about it and let it inspire the choices to come, because if you don't, you might end up with a string of dungeons that all feel a little bit the same. Equally challenging, equally filled with lore, equally stuck with treasure, and so on. Now, since the sample dungeon doesn't exist in an actual campaign, because I know some of my players watch my videos and it would kind of spoil their games if I used it, we're free to choose any purpose that we like. For the in-game purpose of the dungeon, I built on the theme of isolation and say that the dungeon was built by a group of people who wanted to shelter themselves from the wider world. A sort of hermit community, isolated somewhere remote. This immediately means we're going to need rooms in the dungeon that represents living quarters and accommodations, as well as some self-sufficiency, like water collection and that kind of stuff. There might be a religious aspect to it as well, or something that explains the need for isolation. For the meta purpose, let's say that the dungeon needs to be rich with lore. If it was in a campaign, this is where many questions would be answered. The lore can be communicated through art and writing found in the dungeon, but also by the kind of enemies that the players might face. Environmental storytelling will be very important. Now that we have the theme and the purpose, let's move on to the step that you could really have started with if you wanted to, but which I decided to put here after the first two, because they would narrow down our options a little bit. The next step is the wish list. The wish list step is where you put your ideas for the dungeon down on paper and just let your imagination run wild. It's basically a brainstorm but I find the term wishlist more helpful since it puts emphasis on you and what you want. After all, the best way to make something unique is to put a little bit of yourself into it. The things you put on the list can be anything from specific monster types, locations, NPCs, items, and so on. It can be lines of dialogue or a particular kind of trap, color schemes, weather, anything you can think of, just put it down on the paper. You'll probably not use everything that you put on the list, but it should give you an idea of what kind of dungeon floats around in your heart at the moment. You can spend as much time as you want on this step, but for the sake of the brevity of this video, I'm gonna make mine a little bit short. So I have written down the following. Corridor or room buried in sand. Magic item assembled from 2 parts, each part perhaps magical in its own right. A dungeon high in the cliffs. Wind and sand symbolizing time and loneliness. Mummified creatures as enemies, combining the usual stats of the creature with the undead mummy stats. Mummified spiders shooting strings of linen instead of web. Mummified cat that can become a companion. Places of rest and calm, perhaps with water. A long abandoned place. Environmental storytelling. The place was attacked long ago, but the intruders didn't find what they came for, and now the players come for it. Dangerous rope gondolas between cliffs. Birds as a motif. Defensive traps that have been triggered long ago, except in the secret parts of the dungeon. Dusty remains of the old inhabitants and their attackers. A sun forge that can be reactivated by turning and reinstalling lenses, perhaps to reforge an item. Wild animals like birds, which might be scared by the players or disrupt them in their exploration. A wild twist in the exploration, like finding a weird flying contraption or something similar. Frequent windows to the outside world, letting natural light into the dungeon and providing entry points for shapeshifting characters. A flying chair with personality. A ghost from the past. A dangerous room filled with magical darkness and silence that once served as a perfect meditation room. A child kidnapped from a village by a large bird who managed to escape and are now trapped in the dungeon. Treasure hidden in bird's nest collected by the birds over decades. Giant eagles attacking anyone outside the cliffs. Dungeon ends with a rewarding stay in an extra-dimensional oasis. Named characters that show up several times in the lore bits found in the dungeon. And I could go on. But I'll stick with this for now. If you're creating a dungeon completely out of context, you could start with this step and include the ideas of themes and purposes on the wish list, and then go with the one that sparks the most interest. Alright, now I think we have armed ourselves well enough with a basic understanding of the dungeon that we want to make. So let us move on to the first design step. In 1979, Janelle Jaquaysing had her dungeon The Caverns of Thracia published through Judges Guild, and it received much applaud for its complexity and non-linear design. Much later, her design style was termed as Jaquaysing in the dungeon, which is simply put a way to ensure that your dungeon is non-linear. Before I show some of the most effective ways to Jaquays your dungeon, let's briefly talk about why you want your dungeon to be non-linear in the first place. You can have 2 dungeons with the same rooms, but depending on how you arrange them, one can be linear and the other can be non-linear. So what's the advantage of non-linearity if the players are just going to experience the same rooms anyway? The answer lies in player agency. In a linear dungeon, the players just follow the tracks until they reach the end. There might be branches off the main track, but they'll eventually have to go back to the main line in order to progress. In a non-linear dungeon, the players must make decisions about how they navigate the dungeon. Here, branches are real, and deciding whether to go left or right can lead to completely different experiences. Maybe they find a way to bypass the scary troll, or an alternate route that lets them attack a barricaded corridor from behind instead of having to face it head on. The players having options on how to proceed will make it more engaging for them, but it will also make it more interesting for you, the Dungeon Master, since you won't be sure how the players will go through the dungeon. As RPG historian Stu Howarth wrote in his book Monsters, Aliens and Holes in the Ground when he was describing Jaquays' Caverns of Thracia. Jaquays' intricate non-linear spaces are the ideal venue for players to star in stories of their own making. Non-linearity isn't going to give players unlimited agency, but even a little will improve their experience. Alright, now let's look at some of the elements of Jaquaysing that you can put into your dungeon design to make it more interesting to explore. First, we have the very beginning of the dungeon itself, the entry point. This is where the characters enter the dungeon, but we're not limited to just one. multiple entry points gives the players some control over how they want to approach the dungeon before even setting foot inside it. It rewards exploration, and if the players only find the main entrance, they might still stumble upon the alternate entry points inside the dungeon and use them as quick escape routes or something else. Starting the dungeon at the front door is going to be a very different experience than entering in the middle of the second level, where you will be disoriented and maybe even surrounded by enemies. And if you want to be a little bit devious, you could add trapped false entrances to the dungeon, akin to the Tomb of Horror stuff. The second design element is the loop, which consists of two different routes that end up at the same point. This ensures that the choice of direction has meaning, since the players will experience something different depending on which route they take. Once through the loop, the players are faced with a new decision of direction. One will move them further into the dungeon, and the other will let them explore the other half of the loop. The loop is a great building block when you're planning the layout of your dungeon, as you will see later on. Next up is the level connection. Usually a dungeon has at least two levels, which will be physically on top of each other, but they don't need to be. In a dungeon like Sunless Citadel, there's only one way to get from the first level to the second, but what if there were more? Multiple level connections basically create a loop in the vertical plane and works similar to multiple entry points, giving the players a choice on how to proceed. Like, do they go up the stairs, or do they take that ladder that they found in another room? Maybe there's this main level connection, that is the obvious one, easy to find, and then there's one that is hidden, rewarding exploration with a safer passage to the next level. And while we're talking about level connections, you can create non-linearity by having discontinuous level connections, meaning for example that a connection from level 1 leads to level 3 instead of level 2, potentially allowing the players to skip the second level or approach it from another end. Secret paths are an element in their own right. You can hide entire sections of the dungeon behind the secret doors, or use them to reward exploration with shortcuts and additional navigational choices. You can divide levels, perhaps even behind secret doors, so that exploring the other half of the first level becomes optional. And then there are extra dimensional spaces, which can be inserted in unexpected locations in your dungeon, because they don't really need to fit in physically, because they have their own space. And they can be wildly contrasting to the rest of the dungeon. For example, they could lead to a lush golden garden in the middle of a haunted castle, or maybe a refreshing beach resort in the middle of, I don't know, a dusty old tomb or something. There are more and more subtle ways of Jaquaysing your dungeon, but those that I've mentioned so far form a pretty strong base for building your dungeon. For the sample dungeon that I'm going to make, I'll show how all of these work, and I'll try to cram in as many of them as possible, but when you make your own dungeon, you don't need to include all of them if they don't fit. Maybe just having like multiple entry points to the dungeon is enough to make it more interesting in the first place. Okay, time for the dungeon. We have the theme, which is desert and isolation, and the purpose is to provide lore to the players so they better understand what they're up against in this hypothetical campaign of ours. We should decide on how many levels of the dungeon we're going to have. If it's a small crypt for a side quest, maybe one level will be enough, but if it's like the big dungeon at the end of the campaign, maybe 3 or 4 levels is good. For this mid-adventure dungeon that we are making, I think 3 levels would be fine. If you remember from the wishlist, I wrote something about tall cliffs, and this whole desert theme gave me the idea that the dungeon will be inside these tall rock formations, and maybe each level of the dungeon is inside a different column, connected by these rickety ropes with gondolas hanging underneath. But yeah, this is the general idea of the dungeon. Let's keep it in mind, and let's get drawing. Finally, let's draw something. We want to make a diagram of the dungeon, which will be a sort of subway map of the place to give us the clearest sense of the dungeon's layout. I'm basically gonna draw a Milan diagram of the dungeon with the slight variation of trying to fit it into the shape of the dungeon. This will make it easier to understand. The first thing I did was to draw the vague outlines of the dungeon space. These squiggly lines represent the outward-facing cliff sides of the cliff columns in which the dungeon is situated. I decided to merge the column with level 1 and level 3 in it, because I wanted a secret level connection between the two, and it felt difficult to hide such a connection in the open air between the cliffs. Next, I decided where the main entry point would be, indicated with this arrowy thing. This is probably a door at the end of a long staircase winding its way up the side of the cliff. The line to the right of the arrow indicates that there are rooms or corridors here. Then I put a level connection between level 1 and level 2, and between level 2 and 3. The broken lines here indicate a change in level. Then I added 2 loops, one for level 1 and 2, just to kind of flesh out the levels a bit, give them some structure to build upon. The lines in the diagram doesn't indicate straight corridors. If there's a line, it means that there are rooms in this direction. So basically, the loop on the diagram indicates that there are rooms connected in a loop here. Then I connected the level connections with the bulk of the 2 first levels. Next step was adding some stuff to level 3. Again, I gave the level a loop as its primary structure and connected it to the level connection. You might have noticed that so far we have made no decisions about which rooms we'll have in the dungeon. This is all purely layout so far. Next step was adding a discontinuous level connection between level 1 and 3. The dotted line indicates that this part of the dungeon is hidden behind secret doors. At this point, I had the idea that the final room of the dungeon wouldn't be on level 3, but on level 2, and getting to level 2 would require the players to visit level 3. Here I added a branch to the level 2 loop. The dotted line indicates that a part of this branch is hidden behind a secret door. The final room will be at the end of the secret area. Then I added a second entry point to the dungeon. I imagined it could be some kind of hidden tunnel accessible through dense foliage at the foot of the cliff, leading the players directly to level 3. Then I added some more stuff to make the place more interesting. A secret branch on the level 1 loop, a branch with a secret area on level 3, and an ordinary branch on the level 2 loop. Notice that a branch must be more than 1 room deep, because the diagram shows navigational choices, and a single side room doesn't offer any other choices than going back out again. Then, for more complexity, I add passages inside the level 1 and 3 loop, one of them hidden. This basically creates 2 connected loops in each level. Finally, I added a third entry point, again leading directly to level 3, and that is the layout of the dungeon. At this point, I had this idea of the connection between level 2 and level 1 would be locked or blocked somehow, and the key to opening this passage is on level 3. The players can get to level 3 either by finding the secret connection, which, while secret, would still need to be somewhat easy to find given how important it is for progression through the dungeon, or by finding an alternate entry point. I also thought that this place being high up in the cliffs, maybe the wind between the cliffs would be stiff, making it dangerous to travel from level to level without using the gondolas. So the players could enter level 2 from level 3, but since the gondola is waiting on level 2, they would have to climb down the rope and might maybe even be attacked by birds or something on the way. So they can sort of like go an alternate route, but at a great risk. The shape of the cliff outline gave me another idea. Maybe there was this sheltered space in the corner where the birds roost. And the third entry point kind of like goes up the side of the cliff and then through these roosts into some kind of artificial aviary or something that was created by the people who lived here. At this stage, you can feel free to tweak the layout as much as you like. Maybe you think that maybe it's a bit too complicated with these extra loops. Maybe you want something more simple in some areas. And that's the advantage of starting with such a simple layout. It's easy to see the dungeon at this stage before we add the rooms. So make sure that you are pleased with the layout before you continue. Personally, I like this layout, so now it is time to draw the rooms, the corridors and all that stuff. When drawing the actual dungeon, we want to think about the nature of the dungeon because it will decide how the rooms will be shaped and connected and what types of room will be found in there. Take for example a haunted house. Here you'd expect the rooms to be closely packed together with only minimal amounts of corridors connecting them, because that's kind of like how it is in a real house. On the other hand, if the dungeon is a large underground ruined city, you might have these large spaces that are connected by long corridors. A tomb might be mostly corridors because it's a place where it's easy to funnel intruders into traps and then only have a few rooms scattered about. Regarding the types of these rooms, if you make a literal dungeon, you probably want to have prison cells in there. If you have a temple, you'll likely have shrines, a tomb will have trap rooms, an old citadel will have living accommodations for the people who lived there, and a haunted house probably has some kind of master's bedroom. Keeping all this in mind, let me give you a tour of what I came up with. Okay, so this is what I got from the dungeon layout that we made. I can show this is what it looked like, and this is what it turned into. Now this is a lot more complicated and weird looking than the layout, which is kind of the point why we want to finalize the layout as much as possible, so that we don't have to make too many changes once we're committed to this stage of complexity. And I will just really quickly show how these weird winding corridors and rooms are actually matching the layout, so you can get a better understanding of how the layout translates into the actual dungeon. First of all, down here we have the level entrance, which you can see right here. So you have the staircase leading up to the entry point of the dungeon. Then, according to our diagram, we need one loop, and this loop consists of this room, which leads to this room, going into this room, all the way down here to this, and back here. Now the reason why this is an actual loop is because if we want to get to this room from the starting point, we have options. We can go left, which will take us through this room, and then into the room we want to get to. We can also go right, which will take us to this room, then through this, and all the way back in here. Which means that depending on our choice of direction in the first room, our journey to the end point will be different. Of course, when you are in this room, you can explore the other half of the loop if you want to, but again, that is an option. So that is the first loop. As you can see, we have this dotted line that suggests a branch that is secret, which you can see here. So this is a door with an S on it, which means that it is a secret door. Then we have the second loop that is connected to the first loop, and this consists of this room, this one, and this one. So again, if you're in this room and you want to get to this room, if you go left, you will get through this room, and then you get to the end point. If you go right, you go through this room, and then you get to the end point. These are of course very simple loops because they mostly only consist of like 4 or 5 rooms. You can have much larger loops, but this is just to make it as visually clear for the educational purpose as possible. Then we have the level connection to level 2 that we can see here, which is represented by this room that leads to this rope bridge thing that leads up to level 2. And if we go over to the third level, you can see we have the secret level connection, which is represented by this corridor. It is secret in both ends, which is why it is dotted on the diagram, and it connects us to the third level. And the third level consists of this large loop, which we can see starts here, goes through this room, up here, into this room, and then back down here. Again, if you want to get to this room, if you go left or right, we will have different experiences. Again, not insanely different experiences. You could make these loop branches much more complicated and have them loop off in other direction if you want to add even more complexity. But again, this is just to show the loop in action. Then we have the second entry point, the alternate entry point into the dungeon. We have the secret connecting point that basically creates 2 interconnected loops. We have a secret door on both ends, and then we have 2 rooms that are closely connected. Then moving on, we have the third entry point. This is kind of like the ledge where I thought all these birds could be roosting, and maybe crawling through these small holes in the walls or something like that could give player characters access into the dungeon through here. The connection to level 2 is what we see here, and all of these ropes. And then we have this branch which ends in a secret branch or a secret part. On the diagram it is shown like this. In the actual dungeon it is down here. And this is kind of like to illustrate that the diagram doesn't necessarily correlate to the final layout of the dungeon. If we remove this secret room, then we would just have one room on the branch, which meaning that we would remove this from the diagram because you would just be able to go into this room and then back out, and there's no navigational choice in that, so we would not show it on the diagram. As you can see, for example, the side room here is not shown on the diagram. If there was another room here connected to it, we would probably draw like a branch on the diagram. Okay, then we have the second level, the final one. Again, the level is built around the loop. We have this large room in the middle, which goes into this room, down here, into this room, and then back here. Again, if you want to get to this room, there are different routes that you can take. Then we have this side branch, which consists of this room, and then this side room. Then we have this branch that ends with a secret passage. We have one room, then a secret door that leads to what I think will be the final room of the dungeon. Again, these are the very simplest kinds of branches. This is just like one room and then another room, which justifies drawing it as a branch. In your dungeon, you could have a string of 5 rooms if you want. Okay, so that is how the layout translated into the dungeon itself. While I drew the dungeon from the layout, I had ideas about what some of the rooms would be, but most of them were just blank slates. After drawing the dungeon, I made a list of room types that I thought would be expected in a dungeon of this type, and this is the list. It's a place where a hermit society lived in isolation, so apart from living quarters, they would need ways to get water and food. I also added workshops on the list, since they would have to repair and create their own tools and equipment. Using this list of rooms, I designated most of the rooms in the dungeon this way. Whether you designate the rooms as you draw them, or afterwards as I did, doesn't really matter. The reason I did it afterwards was because I wanted to focus on translating the layout into an interesting dungeon map and not get too bogged down in the purpose of the rooms. Alright, so now we have this big empty space that is ready to receive all the monsters and the room decor that we can make up, so let's move on to that phase, filling the dungeon with stuff. This is the moment where we breathe life into our creation, where we pour the ideas from our wish list into the rooms and corridors that were created for them. As with any process, I think it's best to start with the broadest strokes and then move to the details later. So here's a list of the dungeon fill, ordered from the broadest stuff to the most detailed. 1. History of the dungeon. 2. The story of the dungeon. 3. Dungeon quests. 4. Puzzle rooms. 5. Traps, enemies and treasure. Let's start from the top with the history of the dungeon. So far we've given the history many thoughts, and there are several ideas on the wish list pertaining to this, but now it's time to make it concrete. We basically want to create a timeline of the dungeon's past that starts when it was first built and ends when the player characters enter it for the first time. This is something you can be super detailed about, but once again I shall make it somewhat brief for the purpose of this example dungeon. This dungeon's history starts when a group of people had enough with the persecution in their own hometown. They knew about making magical artifacts, and for some reason this was frowned upon by the Puritan society they lived in. They set out into the desert and found a cliff formation with natural caves where they could settle down. Over the years, they fashioned the caves into comfortable living spaces and established a more or less self-sustaining lifestyle out here in the harsh wilderness. Then, many years later, rumors of their secluded society reached unfriendly ears, and a large band of treasure-seeking raiders attacked. They came for an orb which contains the knowledge of crafting magical artifacts, but despite defeating the hermits and ransacking their home, they never found it. They never got what they came for. Now, decades later, the players show up on a quest to find this very same orb and use its knowledge to forge an artifact which will help them in a larger struggle. Unlike the intruders of old, they will find the orb and learn the history of the place as they do so. This is a very simple story, but again, you can make it as complex as you would like and spend as much time as you want on it. The history of the dungeon lays the foundation of what it will actually be, which is why we start with this broadest of strokes. Next, let's talk about the story of the dungeon. This is different from the history by being the experience the players go through as they explore the dungeon. It can be built upon the history, but it doesn't have to. The story could be anything from a murder mystery, which is slowly uncovered and solved throughout the dungeon, or it could be a rom-com, where the players has to try to set up this member of one of the dungeon factions with a member of the other faction in a way to facilitate peace. In this sample dungeon, I want the story to be about uncovering the last day of the society that lived here. The players will find clues to what happened, read messages from those involved, see the action play out in the environmental storytelling. All the while, the big question is, did the intruders get the orb, or is it still here? To keep things simple for this example, I want to center the story around two characters that players can find evidence of. Hypsicrates, who is the sort of keeper of the law the Hermit Society kept, the knowledge and the law keeper basically. And then Mithridatea, who is the leader of the society at the time of the attack. To best keep track of the story and develop it in a clear way, I suggest using the map of the dungeon and draw it directly onto it. So here's the story map of the dungeon. Cut to unscripted nonsense. Okay, so this is the map of the dungeon that shows the story that I have drawn upon it. The pink arrows show the route that the intruders took throughout the dungeon when they attacked. The orange stars represent where there were concentrated battles. So the intruders came up the stairs and got inside. Some of them went to the left and got to this locked door. but they couldn't get through it, so they were turned around and had to go the other way around. Then they went through here, probably ransacked the greenhouse, and we have the first battle. So the character Hypsicrates was present here. They were sort of like maybe not the best warrior, so they witnessed this first battle and sent a message to Mithridatea, but somewhere along the way this message was lost, so the players can actually find it. But Hypsicrates fled from this place, so they got away from the first battle. The battle will be evident by all the corpses littering the place, and like looking at how they are injured and such will tell the tale of this battle. After this, the intruders went up here and split. Some went this way, some went that way, and then we have the second battle up here in the workshop, where the hermits were cornered, completely overwhelmed here. They didn't find the secret passage to level 3, so they went this way, heading towards level 2. And here we can have the body lying in the corridor. It was the messenger sent by Hypsicrates. The invaders reached this workshop where we have the third battle. And this was probably the first proper stand of the society. At this point they knew what was happening. So we have a proper battle here. So there are probably a lot of dead on both sides to show that this is not as one-sided as the other battles. But the intruders did win. And they spread around. Some went down here to the Sunforge. And here there'll probably be some kind of environmental evidence that they explored the Sunforge, trying to figure out how it works. And then they went in here, splitting again. Some went into the ceremony room, some went into the crypt, and like these areas that are not really bodies of the intruders because there weren't really much fighting here. There might be a few bodies from the hermits. They got in here, searched the crypt, and probably shattered a lot of the urns, so this again place looks like it has been ransacked. Some of them went up here and into infirmary, and this will be shown by having the bodies of wounded and sick hermits still lying on their sick beds where they were killed by the intruders. Again, they didn't find the secret passage that would have led them to where they actually needed to go, to this extra-dimensional oasis. And then we have the fourth battle, where they're trying to cross this rope bridge thing. We could have the rope bearing marks of like being cut, like the hermits were halfway through cutting the rope, because if they cut the rope, the intruders wouldn't have been able to get to them. Unfortunately, they didn't finish the rope. Maybe the one who was cutting the rope was shot by an arrow or something like that. This might also dissuade the players if they reach level 3 first and come over here and think like, okay, we could go across here, but maybe they see that the rope is like halfway cut through, which might dissuade them from just going to level 2 this way. But they could. Or maybe they found something to repair it with. If they have the mending spell, they can repair the rope that way. And then I think here lies the body of Hypsicrates, still holding a message that he was like writing to Mithridatea. Maybe a quill still in hand, like this half-finished message, maybe showing a little bit of their relationship. Then the intruders went on, got down here, and for the first time actually found a secret door and ransacked the seed vault. So the seeds are probably still there because they were not interested in the seeds, but it shows that the intruders got in here. Then it spread onwards through level 3, some of them heading into the dining hall, where there's this fifth battle, which is just a desperate shambles. Like the proper defenses have broken down, and this is just like the finish up slaughter basically. They would probably have searched these side rooms. So we need some kind of explanation why, for example, this door is locked when the players get here. Why would the intruders have locked the room? It's just that if the intruders win the battle, they would probably have time to like break these doors down, so why didn't they? And then they went down into the kitchen where the last battle stood, and here we find the body of Mithridatea and the last hermits. Maybe they were trying to get through this secret passage or something like that. Who knows? We'll figure that out in detail when we actually write the room descriptions and such. And then some of them went into the latrines, and I guess at this point they have probably searched a lot of the place. Now the hermits have been destroyed, and they can't find the orb, so they start like bickering and arguing amongst themselves. I mean, they've lost a lot of people getting here, maybe some have lost friends and such in the attack, and they're not rewarded with what they came for, so they start attacking each other. So in the latrines we will see signs of infighting. The bodies of the intruders have clearly been fighting each other. So this kind of like gives an explanation why they haven't brought down all the locked doors, why they haven't found all the secret doors, because they were not here long enough because they started fighting each other. So that's kind of like an explanation for that. So yeah, this is the story. It doesn't really add anything specifically to the dungeon. Like, we still don't have room descriptions, enemies, traps and such. But this is part of the foundation. This informs us what we actually need to put into the rooms when we get to that part. Now let's look at dungeon quests. A dungeon quest is basically a quest that is self-contained within the dungeon. It might start outside the dungeon by someone, for example, telling the players to look for something in there. But ideally, it starts inside the dungeon and it ends inside the dungeon. It could start when the players encounter a lost adventurer who begs them to help them rescue other members of their adventuring party, perhaps with a time limit on it to add some kind of optional pressure. Or the party finds a half-finished artifact which requires them to find other parts throughout the dungeon and reassemble it. It can be as simple or as complicated as you like. In the wish list, I had something about a child having somehow ended up in the dungeon when they were caught by a giant eagle, which they then managed to escape from. So maybe when the party finds this child, she asks them to help find her pet, which is lost somewhere in the dungeon. And maybe they find this pet hanging perilously from one of the ropes connecting the levels of the dungeon. And they can choose to take a great risk to save it, or really disappoint the child. We also had the Sunforge thing, so I think it would be cool if we had some kind of magical artifact that the players can assemble. Maybe they find an odd-looking part in level 1, and then they see schematics in the Sunforge workshop that indicates that there are more parts to be found. They can then choose to search for these parts and use the Sunforge to create this item, but it is entirely optional. I think 2 quests are fine for a dungeon this size, so let us move on to the next step. Puzzle rooms can serve several purposes in your dungeon. They can be a challenge to get some optional treasure, or they can be an interactive way to convey lore or information. I made a long video about creating puzzles, so go check that out if you want detailed information on how to create puzzles and why you want them in your dungeon in the first place. Last step is adding a sprinkle of traps, enemies and treasure. Again, I made a video about traps, and the creation of monsters and opponents are sort of like a little bit outside the scope of this video, so I will focus on the dungeon design aspect. Like with the story, I find it easy to just use your dungeon map and draw these details on it so you have a clear vision of what you have. So let's look at what I made. Cut to unscripted shit show. Okay, so this is the map that I have made that shows all the encounters, the traps, the treasure and the puzzles that I have planned out so far. So let us just zoom in as before on level 1 and take a look at what we've got. First of all, we have a trap over here. So traps will be designated with these squares with dotted lines, the pink squares. And I've written a little bit of text here that says the trap is already sprung by intruders. And this is indicated by this dotted cross in the middle. The idea is that a lot of the traps in this dungeon has already been sprung because there's been this whole invasion in the past, and we kind of see the aftermath of this when the players enter the dungeon themselves. Over here we have an orange star which indicates an encounter, and I have written crocodiles because I thought this place is full of water and it would be like fun to have some crocodiles spring out of the water. I also have these yellow hearts which indicate treasure. So maybe in this pool of water there are like strewn coins, maybe it's sort of like a little bit like a wishing well or something dropped, a necklace or something. Behind this secret passage we have a trap that is not sprung because the intruders never got to this place, and we have some treasure in here which could be the scrolls of lore and such. Moving towards level 2 we have a sprung trap in this way because the intruders went this way, and we have this weird symbol here which indicates the presence of a puzzle. So this is Sunforge that I imagine has all these like lenses and mirrors that focus the sunlight into like heating up some place and maybe imbuing it with some kind of magic and something, and this is where they create some kind of magical item or something. Then down here towards the crypts there would have been a trap, but it's already been sprung because the intruders were here. And then I have an encounter here where I've written ghosts. I thought that this dusty place, there are not a lot of encounters in this dungeon, so maybe a ghost or two could really stand out and bring the sadness and loneliness of this place into focus. Then moving up, we have another encounter in this large room that is again filled with water mostly, and I've written Man-Trap Plant, which is a creature from the Tomb of Annihilation, which is this plant that sends out spores and then lures prey towards it, which is then consumed. Maybe the plants from above have like grown down into these sinkholes and now they're filling up the interior. We have a trap over here that has not been sprung because it is behind a secret door. And then we have the extra dimensional oasis. And I thought instead of them just walking straight into the oasis, maybe they have to solve a very simple puzzle to open it, to open a gate to this oasis, just to make it a little more involved. And we could also have some components you need for this puzzle that are spread around the dungeon, which basically encourages the players to explore some more. Then we have the rope that connects level 2 and 3, and I thought it would be fun to have like giant eagles flying around. So if you're in the gondola moving from level 2 to level 3, it's not going to be a big problem, but if you're crawling along the rope and you're being attacked by giant eagles, then suddenly it's probably more intense. More dangerous plans, not really specified what it could be. That's sort of like left to the next part of the dungeon process, where everything is kind of like rendered into the final version. Another sprung trap. And then we have mummified giant spiders. So maybe this area needs to be a little bit larger. Maybe that needs to be a little more like a warren with more passages and such for these spiders to really shine. I just thought that it would be creepy to like approach this place and you see all these, not cobwebs, but like strands of old linen cloth kind of like hanging here and there, really ominous. And then these mummified spiders attack. Maybe they were like pet spiders at some point, or who knows. Then we move down here. We have 2 traps that have not been sprung. This one is sprung if someone tries to open this secret door without doing it properly. And this one, it's just a trap if you go in here not knowing how to look out for it. But this was never found by the invaders, so they are still here. Then I have a mummified cat here, written as an encounter. I mean, the players could attack it if they want to, but they could also try to adopt it, so it's kind of like up to them. So either it's an encounter or a treasure. And then, but I thought there could be this mad construct that was created by the Hermit Society, and it has sort of been walking around alone for decades, and just everyone it served are gone, its purpose is gone, like this real sad creation, mad with loneliness and such, like the personification of loneliness or something like that. I'm sure you can make some interesting stuff out of that, and it's in the kitchen, so there's a lot of stuff to throw around with. And then some treasure inside the shrine. And that is basically it. Fairly simple. Again, the purpose of this dungeon was to deliver lore and not so much be like encounter heavy and like a real challenge. So that is why it's fairly scarce with the actual encounters. Alright, we basically have everything we need in our dungeon now. At this point, it's a good idea to spend some time fine-tuning what we have before we go on to the next step, because that will begin to really lock things in and make it more cumbersome to make changes later on. For example, removing the crocodiles, which will maybe increase the sense of isolation in the dungeon, and maybe we want to lean more into the ghost part. Once we're happy with what we have, we can go to the final step of collapsing the story and the details map and everything we have into an actual dungeon description. There's a lot to be said about writing room descriptions, how to draw actual maps of the dungeon, how to balance encounters, and so on. The process of turning our concepts and diagrams into the document that makes up the final dungeon, because at the end of the day, a dungeon is mostly just text with a few maps in here and there. This process, which we can call the rendering of the dungeon, is something I want to go into as much detail as possible, but I will do that in the next video. To summarize it all, your dungeon design process should look something like this when you follow my method. First, figure out the theme and purpose of the dungeon. Then, make a list of all the things you'd like to have in your dungeon. Decide on the scope of the dungeon, like how many levels do you want, how large it's gonna be. Draw a Milan-ish diagram of the dungeon based on the various Jaquaysing methods. Fine-tune the layout. List the possible types of rooms that your dungeon should have based on the in-game purpose of the dungeon. Draw the actual dungeon map with rooms and corridors, basing it on the layout and keeping the necessary room types in mind. Then fine-tune the dungeon map. Create the dungeon history as the foundation for the dungeon content. Create the dungeon story to inform specific content. Then add dungeon quests. Then add puzzle rooms. Add traps, enemies, and treasure. And finally, fine-tune before heading into the rendering of all of this information into the final dungeon document. I want to add that while I present this in a very methodical, step-by-step way, the reality of a creative endeavor like making a dungeon is more like solving a crosswords. You end up jumping back and forth when one thing inspires another. Maybe a certain monster that you put in gives you an idea for a change in the history of the dungeon, or a dungeon quest turns out to be more compelling than the dungeon story you had to begin with, so you go back and change that around. I think these steps are still the general direction you should take, but just remember that you are basically expected to move back and forth a bit. And that is it for today. If you don't want to miss the sequel to this video, where I show the rendering process of the dungeon, you can subscribe to my channel. And if you want to support me, give the video a like. If you want an easy-to-read document that details all the information from this video, I have a link to my GM Guild's account, where you can download it for free. Let me know what you thought of this subject in the comments, and until next time, take care of yourself, and I will see you. Bye!